All right, welcome back. We now dig into a 4-week study on philosophy of religion, which is really not enough time, believe it or not. We will have to leave many things out. We should also set our delimitations up front. Religious studies can mean many things and entail many things. Typically, religious studies might involve looking at different tenets of different religions or different belief systems. A course in sociology or anthropology that is interested in religion is descriptive in nature and therefore unable to really dig at the grounding, epistemological or metaphysical, for the philosophy of religion. A survey course in world religions or a comparative study may be able to attend to some theological applications outlining the basic tenets of a religious worldview, but still may not be able to dig as deeply into any given belief system's theology as a course in, for example, systematic theology. A theology course usually targets one religion and digs into theological teachings about ethics or sin and salvation, etc. It may dig at dogmatics or dogmatic theology, which is the particular theological teachings of the Orthodox tradition, or it may look at historical developments of theological traditions across time. It may look at scriptural teachings or historical teachings related to the scripture. So if you want to dig into a religion's theology, you dig into the scripture. And if you really want to dig into the scripture, you try to understand the context in which it was written. In other words, whether or not a scripture may have application for your life, it wasn't given to you in its original context. So it's most likely the case that the way it's worded or its manner of speaking is presented in a way that is understandable to the people to whom it was first given. And then you might have the area of religious apologetics. By now you know that apology in the philosophical sense means to give a defense. So religious apologetics would be building cases for the truth of one particular religious worldview, or building attacks against contrary views as false. And here there is a lot of overlap with philosophy of religion, because any defense is an appeal to truth or an appeal to knowledge. And these, of course, are questions of philosophy. So the philosophy of religion may overlap at several points with theology, but it's really going to focus on questions of the nature of God, who God is may be informed by one's theological tradition, and what we reason about God's nature may then inform our theology. Philosophy of religion also targets questions of epistemology, faith and reason, language, how we talk about God, the nature of miracles, the nature of life after death, the relationship between God and morality, arguments for the existence of God, and the problem of evil. Although we first encountered the term apology with Socrates, and we know by now that the term apologetic can apply to any defense for any given issue, there is a long and rich tradition of apologetics within the Western tradition of monotheism. And this is why it's not uncommon, if you just hear or search online for the word apologetics, you're most likely going to get theistic apologetics. And it's also quite likely that you'll get Christian apologetics in particular, because there's just so much out there that has been contributed from the field of Christian apologetics. Now, even here, religious apologetics can be more or less specified. It really depends on what you're defending. Within any given religious tradition, you may have scriptural apologetics, in which people are building cases for the truth or integrity of a given scripture, or maybe building cases against the claims that there is contradiction within the scripture. Historical apologetics looks at the truthfulness of a scripture or theological teaching in light of history. In other words, if certain things are historically sound, that may add validity to certain theological claims, or especially to certain claims about truth relating to one's scripture. Some religious apologists may focus on comparing and contrasting different religious views in order to build the case that one seems more reasonable or more sensible or more in line with either science or intuition or things like this. Now, anytime someone is building a unique defense of their own religious perspective, then of course there's going to be tension or contrast with other perspectives. But sometimes there may also be points of overlap or agreement. If you are building the case that there are many individual, distinct gods, then it cannot also be true that there is only one God. If someone is building the case that there is no ultimate God, but there's a sense of divinity within all of us or all of nature, then it cannot also be the case that we are all part of an all-encompassing God. But sometimes there are points of overlap, and this is especially true in the monotheistic tradition of Western history. The big three, as they're called, the major religions of the world, are Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And they all agree that there is an absolute, all-powerful, supreme being who created the world and is personally invested in the world. While there are many points of difference when addressing the nature of God, for example, if you're comparing Christianity and Islam, or the divinity of Jesus, if you're contrasting Christianity with both Islam and contemporary Judaism, insofar as one is defending the existence of an all-powerful being who was creator of the universe and will also be its final judge, these three agree that God exists, that He is supreme, that He is worthy of our respect, but that we are guilty of not giving Him that respect. And our rebellious will is in tension with God's will. Since Western history, especially as it relates to the Enlightenment ideals of democracy and justice in society, is built largely upon monotheism, it is monotheism that will receive most of our attention. We will, however, touch upon other marginal areas. This week, for instance, we return to the problem of knowledge, and we raise the question of whether faith lies in contrast to reason. Then, next week, in Module 10, in your homework and preparatory materials, you will ponder various similarities and differences between major religions of the world. And then in class, in the lecture, we will be focusing on beginning to build the case for theism, that is, theistic apologetics. We will begin by pondering the problems of truth and pluralism, and then we will move on to the question of whether miracles are possible. Then, in Module 11, the deepest of the 4 modules ahead, we will build a cumulative case argument for monotheism by surveying various arguments for the existence of God. Finally, in Module 12, we will look at the problem of evil. Now, the question of God is one on which everyone has an opinion, and it's a really important question, right? Because it's such an important question, tethered unavoidably to questions of ethics and the meaning of life and the afterlife and things like this, it is all too easy for people to become emotional when discussing these things. Others remain quite cool-headed, and yet they are unwilling to see things from a different perspective. So I encourage you, if you are a believer in God, try to understand where the atheist is coming from. If you are an atheist, try to understand where the theist is coming from. If you are a believer of one religion, try to understand where the other religions are coming from. At the end of the day, not all views can be true, but we can find many points of agreement, and we can find many places wherein another's perspective, even if it's not our own, can help us to think more intelligibly about our own perspective. So let's agree to play fair with one another, to be charitable with one another's perspectives, and to be respectful wherever we engage in dialogue. I never will forget my first graduate level course in theology. This happened to be a course in the systematic theology of the Christian tradition. Now, I had already completed a master's degree in education, and so I thought I understood the rigor well of a graduate level course. But then I ordered the books for this systematic theology course, and I received 2 mandatory texts, both of which were about 3 inches thick, and we plowed through them. I remember thinking in that moment, wow, despite what I thought I knew, there is so much to know, so much that I don't know. And this is just the first course, so there's so many courses more to go. Now, I share that story to make this point. We can survey the issues well enough, and we will do so in here, for a shallow and generalized understanding. But while our survey may be sufficient for deciding where we stand on the issue, our exploration has not been exhaustive. And so I challenge you to bear in mind that there is so much to be known on any given issue here, and those who are interested in such things likely study them with a passion and study as much as they can get their hands on. So it would be uncharitable to think that you can just quickly disassemble their view with a quick quip or something that you heard some clever person online say. So again, play fair. Whatever your perspective, and you may be right and others wrong, nevertheless, be charitable with the views with which you disagree. So when we philosophize about religion, the first question that we naturally come to is, does God exist? And what are our justifications for giving the reason that we give? If we argue that he does not exist, we still face many questions, especially as it relates to justice or ethics. If we believe that he does exist, then the next question that we face is, what is God like? And what are our reasons for giving the answers that we give? But we quickly find ourselves coming back to that question of epistemology. What do we know and how do we know it? What is true about the world? What is truth? Is there an overall truth that can be known? How do we know what is true? What is justified belief when it comes to these things? And what is the nature of faith? So when it comes to religion, since this involves a belief, whether or not it is justified, in a being that is by definition non-material, because the being is greater than material, God made the material world, then faith is the term that we give for the belief in this immaterial thing. The question is faith based upon justified knowing? And if so, what justifies this knowing? Is faith the sort of thing that is rational and built upon logical arguments? Or is it the sort of thing that defies the rational, and so it is more like a blind leap into an embrace of the irrational, because you can't fully rationalize something that is larger than your conceptual framework? In the first sense, faith is informed by reason, and these two things go together. In the second sense, one of these things is not like the other. In a third sense, they are actually antithetical to one another, and so to have to use logical arguments or reason or rational proofs, on some people's view, is actually to belittle God. And so God might see this as a negative thing, and so you're being more faithful to God if you just leave your mind at the door and it's all heart for him. Or perhaps these are false dichotomies, and so faith involves more of an experience-based knowing that is in many ways pragmatic. And so sometimes it may seem more reasonable, and sometimes some things may seem less reasonable, but perhaps at every stage there is a sort of justified knowing that we might call properly basic, that is built on deep convictions through intuitions that may or may not involve rationalized conclusions. One of the early Christian theologians of the 2nd century, a guy named Tertullian, once asked, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Athens represented the seat of the philosophical heritage, and Jerusalem, for Christianity, represented the seat of religious heritage. So the question was, what has philosophy to do with religion? And really that is our driving question this week. Now, in our contemporary setting, many believe, whether this is grounded in their own worldview or whether they have drunk the Kool-Aid of someone else's worldview, that religion is more of a subjective experience, kind of like a privatized truth or opinion, and doesn't really have any connection to the objective world like the public square. And this is why many people give the justification that you shouldn't bring religion into politics or things like this, because that kind of stuff is privatized opinion, your personal beliefs, and out here we talk about real stuff and truths that matter to everybody. Now, of course, many theists would take issue with that. Plato, for example, would say that if there's a really real, the good, and that determines not only what will be the happy life now or in the afterlife, which is a big question, but also whether or not what we're doing down here is right, then certainly we should bring those questions into politics. Because if it's the case that religious truth grounds justice, and we're just down here talking about injustices and rights left and right, then if we don't actually have the grounding truth for those claims, we can't back it up. Or more to the point of a virtue ethicist like Plato, if we enforce certain things down here within the cave that we are certain are just, and it turns out that they are in fact unjust because of the truths that lie beyond the cave, then what we've done is institutionalize injustices within our social and cultural frameworks. So as I said, it may be the case that there is a pragmatic aspect of faith, because it does involve the subjective knower or experiencer, the one who has to determine whether or not they will live by those claims of truth and knowledge. And at the end of the day, there are many things about religious faith that can't be rationalized for you or believed for you. You've got to do your own work when it comes to what you think is reasonable and what you will commit your convictions to. Yet, even if it's the case that religious faith or justified knowledge when it comes to religion does involve a pragmatic element, this doesn't necessarily mean that religious knowing or faith in its entirety is a sort of pragmatism. Is religion really about whatever works for me? Think about it for a moment. Imagine a marriage in which a husband is unfaithful with several partners over several decades. The wife, however, has no knowledge of his infidelity. This certainly works well for the husband. Should we conclude that it is true that the husband ought to continue in this lifestyle just because it works for him? So too with religion. Just because it works for us, or our belief about God coheres with our other beliefs about the world and human condition and the nature of truth, etc., this doesn't necessarily mean that it really works. Because if there is a God, then that God exists regardless of what we think about God. And if we're expected to live a certain way, then at the end of the day, we are expected to live that way, perhaps even judged according to that expectation, whether or not our own beliefs about ethics and truth cohered with our other beliefs or corresponded to the really real fact, in this case, that there is a God, or not. As you can see, there's much to think about. Is faith just a religious issue, as many people believe? Or is it the case that you have faith in non-religious things as well? And so when it comes to the question of God's existence, Even if you believe he does not exist, you are still investing in that worldview, and you live out your life according to your belief that you're correct, and in doing so, you are investing in a sort of faith. So we've got to think more about this faith question, and we're going to do that in the next class. In the remainder of this class, I want to think more about the nature of worldview and cover a broad overview of differing perspectives concerning the nature of God and the nature of religion. And let's begin with some critiques. What are some common criticisms against metaphysics? One worldview that lies antithetical to metaphysics is scientism. This is the view that scientific methodology trumps any appeal to metaphysics, because metaphysics rests upon unfounded appeals to intuition at the expense of doing real science. So science is king, and if you can't prove it with science, it ain't so. Now, there are problems with this view, and we've already covered some of them without even going into philosophy of religion. When we looked at the problems with knowledge and epistemology, we saw that not only is science based on observation, but it also often requires a prerequisite methodology, a lens through which we will interpret the data from our observations. So when we encounter something that doesn't fit our methodology, then we either have to find some way to cram it in there and make an explanation happen according to that methodology, or else we have to revisit the methodology and maybe tweak some things or consider that our methodology isn't robust enough. Additionally, there are problems with induction. When you observe a large number of crows and conclude that all crows are black because you have repeated this experiment, you reason by induction. This is the way of science. But can you really conclude that all crows are black? In fact, they are not. But until we knew this, any scientist who studied birds that went around saying all crows are black would have been offering a scientific-based truth statement that was true insofar as it cohered with the scientific knowledge of the time, but was actually false. And this is why a pragmatic theory of truth might be the best approach to truth for the scientist. Moreover, science itself appeals to intuition anytime it brings mathematics into the equation. When you put two apples next to two more apples and you conclude that you have four apples, you do this because you already possess a knowledge of two-ness and plusness and equals. Certain concepts are already known to us or available through intuition. We may learn to call these concepts by different names according to the sociocultural tradition or context in which we learn them. Nevertheless, the concepts themselves are already there, and we bring them into our experience. When we do science and we apply to the rules of mathematics, we are bringing mathematics into our science. Mathematical ideas, formulas, these things, they are not empirical things that can be observed. They are ideas, concepts that we intuit, and we bring them in to the science. So the concepts are already there, they're not proved by empirical method. And the question of God is not the only problem for scientism. Any sort of value or appeal to an ideal, whether you're talking about ethics, goodness, badness, beauty, wrongness, justice, human rights, none of these things can be empirically verified. So by the confinements of scientism, they can't count as real things. They can only be human constructs. Another perspective that lies antithetical to metaphysics was logical positivism. Now, scientism and logical positivism both grew out of the Enlightenment heritage. The late 1800s to the first half of the 20th century was heavily influenced by scientism or positivism and logical positivism. Logical positivism refers to a school of thought that began around the 1930s and really held a prominent place in philosophy until about the 1950s. According to this school of thought, metaphysical statements are literally meaningless. Asserting the principle of verification, their goal was to eliminate all metaphysics from our language. So these were analytic philosophers. They're interested in analyzing language, and they were concerned with where we go wrong when we try to talk about big questions. And they decided that where we go wrong is we keep bringing things into our language that don't really make sense. And so the solution is to get that stuff out of our language. According to the principle of verifiability, any statement that is not tautological, which means true by virtue of its logical form alone. Like a definition has all the information you need. If I say a bachelor is an unmarried man, it would make no sense for you to ask, well, is that true? I've given you a definition. By definition, it's true. So according to the principle of verifiability, any statement that is not obviously logically true or empirically verifiable is literally meaningless. So if you say something about the world, if it's obviously true by definition, I can accept that as a meaningful statement. If I don't know, but it's the sort of thing that I can go to the world and investigate empirically, then it's a meaningful statement. Or I can at least determine whether or not it's a meaningful statement once I get that information from the investigation. If it doesn't fit either one of these things, then it's literally meaningless. And this is why the logical positivist who developed that principle of verifiability, A.J. Ayer, also from this derived his theory of ethics, Emotivism, that whenever we say that is right or that is wrong or this is good or that is bad, all we're doing is emoting. That can make sense. I can point this thing, this action, so we'll call that X, is, we can put an equal sign there, good. Where are we going to find that? It cannot be empirically observed. The action is, that's what we called X, so our equation is X equals, but we don't have any way to finish the statement because good is not the sort of thing that can be empirically verified. So that must not really be a meaningful statement. It's really just an insight into your emotion. When you say that is good, you're not really saying that is anything. You're just saying, I like that. Or that. Hooray. Well, if it follows for ethics, it would certainly follow for religion. So if you speak of God from this perspective, then you're not really talking about anything meaningful, because the existence of this being of whom you speak is not clearly true in the same way that a definition is clearly true, and it's not the sort of thing that we can empirically investigate, so it must be literally meaningless. As it turns out, logical positivism doesn't work, primarily because the principle of verifiability turns out to be self-defeating. The principle states that any statement that is not obviously true or empirically verifiable is meaningless. Yet the principle itself cannot be empirically verified and is not obviously true. Thus, the principle of verifiability cannot meet its own criteria. It falls to contradiction. A final criticism of metaphysics comes from Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant believed that God is necessary for morality to have any meaning, and yet he also believed that we have no access to the metaphysical realm in order to construct rational proofs, in order to know anything for certain. In a sense, then, we have to live as if such things are possible, because they do seem to be so deeply intertwined with our deep convictions about the structure of the world. Alas, perhaps we can catch glimpses of such a reality, but we can never really know for certain, beyond all reasonable doubt, whether such metaphysical ideas truly exist. So, of these three criticisms of metaphysics, the first two are flawed. Kant actually saved metaphysics, you will recall, from the hands of staunch empiricists. However, he also gave up some of the rationalists' grounding for speaking of metaphysical things. Now, Kant's view may be flawed as well, but of these three, he provides the most difficult challenge as far as it concerns the issue of faith and reason. And we will look more closely at the paradigms on faith and knowledge in the next class. Now I want us to examine the nature of a worldview in order to ponder why it's so significant for questions in the philosophy of religion. The word worldview comes from the German word Weltanschauung, which literally means to look onto the world. So a worldview is like a pair of glasses, a lens through which you see the world. In the same way that the paranoia of a germaphobe will affect everything within his or her life, so too your worldview works the same. In the words of James Sire from his The Universe Next Door, a worldview is a set of propositions or assumptions which we hold, consciously or subconsciously, about the basic makeup of our world. Or, as explained by Gary Phillips and William Brown in Making Sense of Your World, a worldview is, first of all, an explanation and interpretation of the world, and second, an application of this view to life. So your worldview about the world will come out in the applications, the way that you live your life or your ethics. A worldview must answer four defining questions. What is the origin of human life? What is the meaning of human life? What is the nature of human morality? What is the nature of human destiny? A worldview must also meet four absolute needs. Our need for knowledge. Where do I come from and how should I live? Our need for community. With whom ought I to identify? How so and why? Our need for justice and hope or forgiveness, both evil within the human condition and individual human guilt, must be dealt with comprehensively by any given worldview. And finally, our need for legacy or meaning, eternal or everlasting significance. Even if eternal destination is rejected, the question of the individual's place or participation in something bigger than him or herself, something that will last beyond their lifetime, must be answered. Finally, your worldview affects your epistemology, how you define truth. It affects your metaphysics, how you view reality and the question of an afterlife. It affects your cosmology, how you view the origins of life in the universe. It affects your teleology, how you measure personal purpose. It affects your theology, how you see God and how you interact with Him if you believe He exists. It affects your anthropology or sociology, how you interact with other human beings in terms of justice. It affects your axiology, how you determine what is good or bad, beautiful, virtuous, or evil. So belief systems give reasons for the way things are and then influence community values and actions based on those reasons. So let's look at an overview of the basic worldview options. Our first question involves the nature of the universe itself. Either the world is an illusion, or it was self-created, it is self-sustaining, or it was created. The next question is the God question. And broadly speaking, there are 7 basic perspectives. Now, theism can refer to a number of beliefs about God, theo, God, but typically if you just hear the word theism, it's implying monotheism. This involves the big 3 of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The monotheist believes in a creator, separate from, yet concerned with, or intimately involved with creation. Traditional monotheism has spoken of God as being omnipotent, that is, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, omnipresent, everywhere, and omnibenevolent, or all-loving. Deism is really the product of the Enlightenment, going back to that great debate between rationalism and empiricism. Those who were convinced that God existed, but, thanks to Kant, many were struggling with the idea of a physical world that functions in a very mechanistic way. In the same way that they were having difficulty accounting for things like mind or free will within a mechanistic material world, so too, even if they were convinced in God's existence and believed that you could prove that with certain arguments, there remained an uncertainty, probably largely thanks to Hume, as to the nature of miracles. So the deist believes in God as logically necessary, but because they have difficulty accounting for miracles, they believe that God is impersonal and uninterested. So central to deism was the rejection of supernatural events, and this included miracles. It included the incarnation, or the birth of God as Jesus, and also the resurrection of Christ, because that would be a miracle. Some consider this the Skeptics' religion. They believed that God created the natural order, but that it would be irrational for him to then negate the physical laws he created by interacting with the physical world. So on this view, a creator is necessary, but then after creation, God simply walks away. Since miracles are impossible, God is not involved. So we may have been created by God, but we are not accountable to God. Quite fitting of the Enlightenment optimism and confidence in the human mind. On this view, human reason is held to be more authoritative than divine revelation. Thomas Jefferson called himself a Unitarian. This is one who professes to believe in God, but rejects the concept of a Trinitarian God. But his writings were strikingly deistic. For example, his work entitled The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, also known as the Jefferson Bible, is a copy of the Bible that redacted all references to the supernatural. It took out the miracles, the prophecies, the angels, the demons, the divinity of Christ, as well as the resurrection. The popular appeal to Jesus as a good moral teacher, removed from both his claims about being God and the only way to salvation, and the historical points about so many people claiming to have seen a resurrected Christ, quite likely goes back to this deistic influence on American culture. Next, we have polytheism. This is the belief in many gods, often related to nature, the seas, thunder, fertility. Often there are hierarchies among the gods. This is often seen with mythology. And because, aside from the variable of power in the mythologies, these gods really seem to act more like human beings, often moved by their own desires and passions. There is often warring among the polytheistic gods. In addition to the classical mythologies found in ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt, etc., it also shows up in other forms. For example, Animism is the oldest form of polytheism. On this view, there are souls in all things. Now, this isn't quite a polytheism in the sense of there being distinct beings that we call gods. Rather, it's most like polytheism in its earliest stages, wherever it is supposed that we should appease spirits to keep them from being angry and taking out vengeance upon us, or to keep them satisfied so that they might help us. And this ties into ancestor worship and basic superstition and stuff like that. So while it does not involve religious practice of appeasing a plethora of God beings, it does involve religious practices seeking to appease a multitude of spirit souls. Polytheism also shows up in the form of theistic dualism. Now, poly means many, theism, theo, God, and really all you have to have is more than one. And in cases like Zoroastrianism or Wicca, also known as paganism, you have a good and evil that are really co-equals in balancing nature, for instance. And so you have the masculine and the feminine, light and dark, fire and water, death and life. And these things are not ultimately bad or good, but they represent a necessary give and take that is all part of the cycle or circle of life. And finally, there's Hinduism. Now, Hinduism is quite complex, and the actual form of Hinduism might differ according to the Hindu with whom you speak. Generally speaking, Hindu deities all have and share a part of Brahman, and Brahman is ultimate reality. And so you have millions of gods, and these are all incarnations either of Brahman, in which case they're called avatars, or of lesser gods called devas. Morality then depends on which deity you worship. Now, some will make the distinction that Brahman is one god that shows up in different ways, and so the other, what some people are calling the other gods, are just different avatars of the one, Brahman. But you still have the plethora of other devas there as well. Pantheism holds that the divine and the universe or nature are the same. And so God is in all things, or God is the main ingredient of reality. We saw this with Stoicism. Panentheism holds that all is in God. We saw this with Hegel's idealism, in which all of our reality amounts to ideas within the all-mind or absolute spirit mind. In pantheism, God permeates everything. In panentheism, all of reality is a part of God. He is not in us, we are in Him. Our reality is a part of God's body. In the same way that your liver cannot know you, it just functions. You might loosely say it understands its place and function within you. So too, we cannot know anything about our host. God is ineffable. We simply experience His cosmic force or energy, which is to be respected. There is no place here for a personal judge. The New Age movement owes much to panentheism. Deepak Chopra, for example, is associated with Hindu New Age thought. Espousing a school of thought called the Vedanta, he encourages that if you release from your self-identity, you become free to realize your God spark, your true identity. Once you find the God spark within you, you will then find health and success and healing, etc. This is really nothing new. After the rise of Christianity, there was a movement called Gnosticism. Several New Testament letters address this. Gnostics reference the same God spark. We are all divine sparks trapped within the material world, enslaved by our ignorance. Secret knowledge is the key to salvation. Next, we come to agnosticism. So, Gnostic has to do with knowledge. Gnosticism advanced the idea of acquiring a secret knowledge. The prefix a means not or non, so agnosticism means lacking knowledge. And there are stronger and weaker forms. On the strong form, we are not capable of knowing God. Theological issues cannot be proved nor disproved. They are beyond our ability. They are matters of faith alone. Faith is completely separate from reason. Issues of faith cannot be demonstrated like issues of science. Weak agnosticism simply means that you're currently undecided. And you can be agnostic on some points and not others. For example, you can be confident that there is a God, and maybe even you have confidence concerning which sort of God you think he is. And yet you may plead agnosticism when it comes to issues of the creation narrative or age of the earth or the nature of creation, whether it happened in a single day or a set of periods, etc. And finally, atheism is a denial of God's existence or authority in some capacity or at some level. And there are several types. First, practical atheism. The practical atheist may believe in God in theory, but this short reflection does not really impact their ethics. They live as if God does not exist, or believing that God does exist, they live as if God has no authority over their life. They will not have to answer to God. Now, recall the pragmatism of William James when it came to the issue of God's existence. He said that belief in God was a forced, momentous, and live option that we can't help but realize. And so we're justified in taking that belief at face value. So James might even say that since it is a forced option, then to avoid the choice to believe in God leads one necessarily to become a practical atheist by default. In other words, you can plead agnosticism for the moment, but you cannot play the agnostic card your entire life, or you end up becoming a practical atheist by default. So practical atheism could refer to the believer who doesn't live it out, or the agnostic who never makes a move and becomes an atheist by default. As to the one who professes atheism, there is also a strong and weak form. Weak atheism, also called negative atheism or soft atheism, is the belief that God does not exist, but without arguments asserting that God cannot exist. Strong atheism goes beyond this. Strong atheists are active proponents of the non-existence of God. Reasoning leads them to conclude that God, in fact, does not exist, and they think they can prove it and convince you as to why you should not believe either. And you can find atheism throughout history. The ancient Greek Diagoras is considered the first atheist. According to the Greek sophist Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. During the Enlightenment, Thomas Hobbes opposed Christianity, and David Hume was hostile toward all religion. During the age of Romanticism, atheists appealed to the imagination to depict a world free of God and religion. For example, Friedrich Nietzsche said God is dead. Religion is a crutch for the weak, a tool of oppression over those who would be masters of their own fate. Also during this time, Karl Marx, who called religion an opiate of the people, turned atheism into a social movement. The state becomes godlike. In the U.S. in the 20th century, secular humanism adopted a creed called the Humanist Manifesto, which openly denounced religious belief as not befitting of the intellectual. According to French philosopher Auguste Comte, who was considered father of both positivism and secular humanism, God is humanity, the pinnacle of nature. According to Ludwig Feuerbach, who influenced Karl Marx, God is subjective and psychological, a product of man's idealized consciousness. In his words from The Essence of Christianity, man has his highest being, his God, in himself. The feeling of God is nothing else than a man's highest feeling of self. God is man, man is God. There's also a newer wave of atheists that have become more evangelical, you might say, in their approach to atheism. Rather than simply making sure that they present arguments for atheism, The neo-atheists actually seem to have an antitheistic agenda, that is, to deconvert believers. People like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and others argue that religion is dangerous and intolerant. In the words of Richard Dawkins, science flies men to the moon, religion flies planes into buildings. The most common major objections to religion are that it is illogical, or it doesn't matter what you believe, or all religions are basically the same, or there are seeming contradictions or inconsistencies within a given view. For example, concerns with theological doctrine, or historical facts, or issues with Scripture. Another common objection is, why is there evil and suffering in the world? It seems that either God is not all good, or else God is not all powerful. This is the problem of evil. And finally, in contrast to exclusivism, the idea that there is only one way to get to God, there's the question, what about those who have never heard of that one way? 3 common non-religious perspectives on religion are that religion is harmful or evil, religion is unnecessary or not really beneficial to society, and that religion is good for appeasing people's need for meaning, but it's really a pathetic sort of pacifier for the unintellectual. Philosopher Bertrand Russell advanced the first view with his statement that all religion is built upon fear. And of course, as we just saw, Richard Dawkins supports that idea. David Hume represents the second category. He actually said that many religious folk teeter towards fanaticism, but if they can keep that in check, it might not hurt anyone, although it will not benefit anyone either. And of course, Marx's comment that religion is just an opiate for the people, an idea that you buy into to make yourself feel better about your life, represents the third view. Attacks on religion can come from philosophy, insisting that religious claims are illogical or not logically convincing. Attacks can come from psychology, insisting that the mind constructs a need for God. Attacks come from sociology in the form of insisting that religion is simply a means of manipulation, political power play, institutionalizing power over marginalized perspectives, etc. This is the claim of critical theory. Some attacks may even come from within certain traditions on theology, insisting, for example, that religion is inconsistent and irrelevant, and so we should set aside a lot of the dogma. Nevertheless, some of its activist aims might be good. Of course, anytime you tear away claims of justice and goodness and rights from their theistic grounding, you may find it more difficult than you think to attach those ideals to the foundations of a different worldview. And finally, as we saw earlier, some attacks come from science, insisting that there are no scientific proofs available to convincingly show that God exists, and the lack of evidence is proof to the contrary. Next time we will pick up with a closer examination of the nature of faith and the question of its relationship to reason, and we will look at 3 paradigms in particular for approaching this issue through a theistic lens.